The morning August Redmond rode onto Ella Rhodes's land with that demolition order tucked into his coat pocket was the same morning she had already beaten him to the courthouse and back. Dust rose in long yellow curtains across the flat Texas panhandle as his horse, a big roan gelding named Copper, picked his way down the rutted road that led from the town of Caldwell Creek toward the Rhodes homestead. It was the spring of 1884, and the land was just beginning to green up after a hard winter that had buried half the cattle in Comanche County beneath 2 feet of unforgiving snow. The sky above was the kind of pale, washed-out blue that promised heat by noon and maybe a thunderstorm by evening, and the red earth still held the last faint memory of moisture in its cracked surface. August was not a bad man. That was the thing about him that made the whole situation so complicated from the very beginning. He was 28 years old, broad in the shoulder, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and gray eyes that people tended to remember long after they had forgotten the rest of his face. He worked as a land agent for the Caldwell Creek Development Company, which was a fine-sounding name for an outfit that had been buying up struggling homesteads all across the county for the better part of 2 years. His employer, a man named Gerald Holt, had told him that the Rhodes property was abandoned. Gerald Holt had said, very specifically, that the widow who had inherited the land from her late father had packed up and gone east, and that the only thing left standing on that half-section was a rotting farmhouse that was falling down on its own anyway. Gerald Holt had lied about most of that. August pulled Copper to a stop at the edge of the yard and looked at what stood before him, and what stood before him was most certainly not an abandoned property. The farmhouse was in better shape than half the buildings in Caldwell Creek itself. The porch boards were new. The whitewash was fresh enough that it still smelled faintly of lime in the warm air, and someone had planted a kitchen garden along the south wall with the kind of careful attention that spoke of permanence and intention. A pair of mended curtains moved in the open window. A dog, some kind of shaggy brown cattle dog, lifted its head from the porch step and watched him with intelligent, suspicious eyes. And there, coming around from the side of the house with a basket of eggs in one hand and a look on her face that suggested she had been expecting him, was Ella Rhodes. She was 25 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a plain straw hat, and she wore a faded blue work dress that was clean and carefully mended at the left sleeve. She was not a fragile-looking woman. There was something in the way she carried herself straight-backed, deliberate, unhurried that made August think of someone who had learned a long time ago that the world did not slow down for uncertainty. Her eyes were brown, almost amber in the morning light, and they were fixed on him with an expression he would later describe to himself as calm challenge. "Mr. Redmond," she said, setting her basket down on the porch step and crossing her arms. "I wondered when you would get here." August blinked. He had not introduced himself. "You know who I am." "I know who works for Gerald Holt," she said, "and I know what you are carrying in your coat pocket, so you might as well take it out and get it over with." He climbed down from Copper slowly, holding the gelding's reins, and reached into his coat and produced the demolition order. It was a legal document, signed by a county judge named Harold Farris, declaring the structure at the Rhodes homestead to be an abandoned property subject to clearing in accordance with the Caldwell Creek Development Company's acquisition of the surrounding land grant. August had not liked carrying it when Gerald Holt handed it to him that morning, and he liked it even less now. "Miss Rhodes," he began, because he had rehearsed a careful, professional speech about the county's land development policy and the difficulty of maintaining clear title in the region. "Rhodes," she corrected. "Mrs. Rhodes. I was married for 3 years before my husband passed. I kept the name. Mrs. Rhodes." He cleared his throat. "This order gives the Caldwell Creek Development Company the right to clear the structures on this property within 30 days on account of it being abandoned," she said pleasantly. "Yes, I read the copy that was filed at the courthouse." "You read it?" "I did. I rode into Caldwell Creek 3 days ago when I heard Gerald Holt was filing papers. And while I was there, I also visited Mr. Samuel Briggs, who is an attorney licensed to practice in the state of Texas, and he was very helpful. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded document of her own, crisp and official-looking, and held it out toward him. This is a counter-injunction, signed by Judge Alvarez over in the district court in Abilene, staying the demolition order pending a full title hearing. Mr. Briggs tells me that my father's deed is recorded and uncontested, and that no abandoned property claim can stand when the rightful owner is present and maintaining the land, which, as you can see, I am. August took the document. He read it carefully, because he was a thorough man, and the more he read, the more clearly he understood that it was exactly what she said it was. It was properly executed, properly sealed, and the name of the judge on it was a man known throughout West Texas for not being easily influenced by development money. He folded it again and looked at her. "Your lawyer did good work," he said. "Mr. Briggs is very good at his job," she agreed. "And before you ask, he will also be representing me at the title hearing, which is scheduled for 6 weeks from Thursday." August looked down at the demolition order in his own hand. Then he looked up at Ella Rhodes, who was watching him with that same expression of calm, unhurried readiness, and something in his chest shifted in a way that had nothing to do with legal documents. He folded the demolition order and tucked it back into his coat pocket. "Well," he said, "it appears I have no business here today." "No," she said, "you do not." Then something in her expression softened just slightly, and she nodded at the basket on the step. "But you have ridden a fair distance in the morning heat, and I have fresh coffee on the stove if you want it before you ride back." He should have said no. He was there on behalf of a company that was trying to take her land from her, and accepting her hospitality was, at the very least, professionally awkward. He said yes. He tied copper to the post at the edge of the yard, and he went up onto the porch, and Ella Rhodes poured him coffee in a tin cup and set a plate of corn bread on the table between them. They sat in the 2 chairs on the porch, with the spring wind moving across the land and the cattle dog. She called him Buckshot, lying between their chairs watching the horizon for things to bark at. "How long have you been back?" August asked. 8 months, she said. "I went east to my mother's people in Tennessee after my husband died, because I did not know what else to do. But this land belonged to my father and his father before him, and I came to understand that there was no amount of grief that would make me sign it away." "What happened to your husband?" She looked out at the land. "Fever, the summer before last. It took him fast." There was no performance of grief in her voice, only the quiet weight of something that had been lived with long enough to be carried steadily. "What about you, Mr. Redmond? Are you from Caldwell Creek?" "No," he said. "I grew up north of here near Amarillo, came south 2 years ago looking for land work. And Gerald Holt found you." "He found me." There was something in the way he said it that was not pride. Ella looked at him sideways. "Do you believe in what he is doing, buying up these homesteads?" The honest answer was complicated. August wrapped both hands around his cup. "I believe in clear legal title," he said carefully, "and in people's right to develop land they lawfully own. What I believe about the methods Gerald Holt uses is a somewhat different question." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer or something very like it. "Well," she said, "at least you did not lie to me." When he rode back to Caldwell Creek an hour later, the demolition order still folded in his coat, August Redmond was thinking about amber eyes and corn bread, and a woman who had ridden 20 miles to Abilene and back in 3 days to protect what was hers. He was also thinking, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, about Gerald Holt and about the methods Gerald Holt used. Gerald Holt was not pleased. He was a large man, fleshy in the way of men who had been wealthy long enough to stop worrying about whether there was enough food, and he had a habit of standing too close to people when he was displeased with them, as if the sheer mass of his presence could substitute for a valid argument. He stood close to August in the office above the general store that served as the development company's headquarters, and looked at the demolition order in August's hand, with an expression of profound offense. She had a lawyer, August said again, because Holt had not seemed to absorb it the first time. A counter-injunction from Judge Alvarez in Abilene. The title hearing is in 6 weeks. There is nothing more I can do about the demolition order, Mr. Holt. Judge Alvarez, Holt repeated, and his jaw worked briefly. I see. The property is not abandoned, August continued. She has been in residence for 8 months and the structures are well maintained. Any judge in the district will see that. Any judge except a few, Holt said, in a tone that August did not like at all. August set the demolition order on Holt's desk. I want to be clear about something. I am willing to do legitimate land work, legal acquisitions, proper surveys, deed research. I am not willing to be part of anything that involves pressuring a sitting judge or manufacturing a false claim against a woman who has clear title to her family's land. Holt looked at him for a long moment. You have gotten very principled all of a sudden. I have always been principled, August said. I was just not always aware of what I was working for. He walked out of the office and down the stairs into the street, and he stood for a moment in the afternoon heat thinking about what he had just done and whether it was irreversible. Caldwell Creek was a small town, the kind where a man's reputation was a working tool, and he had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county. He was also, he realized, no longer entirely sure he was employed. He spent the rest of that day thinking, and the thinking led him back, by a route he could not entirely account for, to the Rhodes homestead. He did not go back that day. He was not so far gone as that. But he went back 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, ostensibly because he wanted to tell Ella Rhodes that he had removed himself from the Holt development project, and that she should be aware that Holt was the kind of man who did not accept defeat gracefully. He told himself this was a professional courtesy. She was mending fence on the east side of the property when he arrived, and she looked up at him with a wariness that was entirely justified and that he found himself wanting, more than he could logically explain, to deserve his way out of. Mr. Redmond, she said. I no longer work for Gerald Holt, he said before she could ask. As of 4 days ago. I wanted you to know that because I think he is going to try other methods before the title hearing, and I think you should be careful. She was quiet for a moment, a fence staple held between 2 fingers. What kind of methods? I do not know specifically. But he mentioned judges, and I do not think he was talking about legal procedure. August pulled Copper up alongside the fence line. Is there anyone looking after this property with you? Anyone who can keep an eye on things? I have buckshot, she said, and there was a faint edge of dry humor in it that he found disarming. Then she set the staple. And I have neighbors to the north, the Garza family, who have been kind, but I manage the property myself mostly. He watched her work for a moment. Her hands were competent and quick, and she did not ask for help, but when he climbed down from Copper and picked up the second end of the wire she had been struggling to hold straight, she did not tell him to stop either. They mended the length of fence together in a silence that was more comfortable than it had any right to be, given the circumstances. When they were done, she dusted her hands on her skirt and looked at him in the clear spring light. Why did you leave Holt's company? Because you were right, he said simply. And I had known it for a while, but seeing a woman with a counter-injunction and a lawyer made it difficult to keep pretending otherwise. Her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. You give me too much credit. I give you exactly the right amount, he said. He started coming back regularly after that. There was always a reason, a fence that needed mending, a question about the well, a piece of information he had gathered in town about Holt's movements. He was careful not to make too much of the visits, even to himself. But the truth was that the Rhodes homestead had become the part of his week he looked forward to most, and Ella Rhodes had become the person whose opinion he found himself measuring his own thoughts against. She was not easy company, in the way that some people are easy, warm, and open and quick to fill silences. She was thoughtful and a little guarded, and she said exactly what she meant, which was a quality August had not encountered so clearly in a person before and which he found, paradoxically, deeply restful. She had a humor that was quiet and bone-dry and tended to surface when he least expected it. She asked good questions. She listened to the answers. The land itself was part of it too. The Rhodes homestead sat on a bend of the creek the town was named for, and it was beautiful in the particular way of West Texas land, which was not soft beauty but something vast and unhurried, all long sight lines and enormous sky, and the smell of cedar and dry earth and the clean sharpness of water moving over rock. Ella knew every part of it. She could tell him which area of the pasture held water longest after rain, which stand of cottonwoods the wild turkeys used, where her father had tried and failed to grow corn, and where the soil was rich enough to grow almost anything. She was going to fight for this land with everything she had, and he understood, in a way that had nothing to do with legal documents, why. In town, things were less comfortable. Gerald Holt had made it quietly known that August Redmond was not to be trusted in matters of business, which meant that 2 of the 3 other potential employers August had identified wanted nothing to do with him. The third was a cattle rancher named Porter who needed a hand for the spring drive, but could only offer seasonal work. August took it because he needed the income, but it meant he was away from Caldwell Creek for stretches of 2 and 3 weeks at a time, and during those stretches he thought about Ella Rhodes more than he thought was entirely wise. He wrote her a letter from the trail, which surprised him when he did it, because he was not a man who wrote letters. He explained where he was and that he would return before the title hearing. He told her the cattle drive was going well and that the land north of the county line was looking green. He said he hoped things were quiet on the homestead. He did not say that he had been thinking about her, because that was the kind of thing a man put in a letter only when he was fairly sure of its reception. She wrote back. The letter reached him at the cattle camp 3 days before the drive ended, and when the other hands teased him about it, he let it go because the letter was worth any amount of teasing. She wrote in a clear, precise hand, and she told him the east fence had held through the spring storms, and that Buckshot had chased a coyote halfway to the Garza property and come back looking extremely pleased with himself. She said that Mr. Briggs had written to confirm that the title hearing date was confirmed and that the evidence was favorable. She said she was glad he had written and that she hoped the rest of the drive went well. She did not say she had been thinking about him either, but he read the letter 4 times and was fairly sure she had. When he came back to Caldwell Creek in the 3rd week of May, there were 2 developments worth noting. The first was that Gerald Holt had apparently spent the intervening weeks working a different angle, and the angle he had chosen was to approach the county commissioner with a claim that the Rhodes homestead sat on a right-of-way for a proposed railroad spur. This was not true, as Samuel Briggs had already established, but it had resulted in a surveying crew appearing at the edge of Ella's property one Tuesday morning and behaving in a way that was designed to be intimidating without being technically illegal. Ella had met them at the fence line with Buckshot at her heel, a written copy of the property boundary survey in her hand, and the name of her attorney on her tongue, and the surveying crew had packed up and left by noon. August heard this story from Maria Garza, her neighbor to the north, who had come into town for supplies and who told it with considerable admiration. When he rode out to the homestead that same afternoon, Ella was in the garden and she looked up at him with that calm, direct expression that he was beginning to understand was not coldness but a very particular kind of strength. "I heard about the surveyors," he said. "It was a nuisance," she said. "Nothing more. Holt is getting desperate." "Good," she said. "Desperate men make mistakes and I have a very good lawyer." He sat down on the upturned wooden crate she used as a garden stool when she was not using it herself, and he watched her work for a moment. The light was long and golden in the late afternoon, the way West Texas light got in May, and it was catching in her hair and along the line of her cheekbone, and August thought that if he had to name the exact moment he understood he was in serious trouble, it would probably be that one. "Ella," he said, and she looked up, and the use of her first name hung in the air between them for a moment like something that had been said out loud for the first time. She did not correct him. "August," she said quietly, testing it back. "I would like to help you with the title hearing if you will let me. I know how Holt operates. I know which records he falsifies and how he files the paperwork, and I think Samuel Briggs could use that information." She sat back on her heels and looked at him steadily. "You would testify against him. If it comes to that," he said. "I was there long enough to know what was happening. I should have said something sooner. That is on me." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the evening birds started up in the cottonwoods along the creek, their small bright sounds threading through the still air. "That is not a small thing, August," she said finally. "That is a significant risk to you. I know it. He will make things very difficult for you in this county." "He already has," August said, with a slight lift of his mouth that was not quite a smile. "It turns out I am more concerned about other things." The look she gave him then was searching and careful, the way she looked at everything thoroughly, without rushing, as if she wanted to be certain she was understanding what she was seeing. And then something in her face softened in the way it had that very first morning on the porch, and she said, "Thank you, August. I accept." He nodded, and because he was not sure what else to do with what was happening in his chest, he asked if she needed help with the far side of the garden, and she handed him a hoe, and they worked until the light gave out. It was after supper, sitting on the porch again. She had made stew from the last of the winter squash and fresh bread, and the meal had settled into something warm and easy between them that she said, out of a comfortable silence, "Tell me about where you grew up." He told her about the high plains north of Amarillo, about his father's small spread, and the way the wind came across it in winter like something that had made up its mind to flatten everything. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and about how his father had not been a cruel man but had been a very quiet one after that, and about how August had learned to fill his own silences. He told her about leaving at 18 with a horse and $40 and no very clear plan. She listened the way she always listened, with her full attention, and when he finished she said, "You have been looking for a place to put down roots for a long time." "I think so," he said. She looked out at her land, at the dark shapes of the cottonwoods against the deep blue of the evening sky. "It is a very good feeling," she said quietly, "when you find the place." He looked at her profile in the evening light and thought that she was not only talking about land. He was not certain she knew that he understood that. He thought she might. He rode back to town that night later than he should have, and the full moon laid a silver road across the prairie ahead of him in copper, and he thought about roots and about places, and about a woman with amber eyes and the patience to mend fence and fight surveyors in the same day. The weeks before the title hearing took on a particular quality of suspended time, the way important things tend to slow down before they arrive. August rode out to the homestead 3 times a week and sometimes 4, always with a purpose, and always staying longer than the purpose required. He helped replace the sagging gate on the south pasture and clear the irrigation channel from the creek that had silted up over winter. He sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked about everything and nothing, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the space between them on the porch shrank, not physically but in the way that emotional distance is close when two people are paying attention to each other. Ella showed him the deed box one evening, a wooden box with a brass latch that her father had kept under a loose floorboard in the bedroom. Inside was the original land deed, dated 1861, with her grandfather's name on it, and her father's name added in a neat clerk's hand in 1879 when the property passed to him, and Ella's own name added by Samuel Briggs after her father's death the previous year. The paper was worn soft at the folds, and the ink had faded to a warm brown, but every signature and seal was clear and legal and undeniable. 3 generations, August said, holding it carefully. 4, if you count my grandfather's father, who first worked this land before the deed was formalized, she said. He came out here before the war, built the first structure on this property with his own hands. She took the deed back and folded it along its old creases. Gerald Holt did not do his research when he picked this property to claim. I think he thought you were gone and would stay gone, August said. A lot of people have thought that kind of thing about me, she said. There was no bitterness in it, only a clean, matter-of-fact quality that he admired. He hesitated and then said what he had been thinking for a while. Your husband's passing. Did people expect you to sell after that? She was quiet for a moment. Yes, some were kind about it, some were not. There were men who rode out here within 3 months of James dying to make me offers, as if the land were a thing I was holding onto by accident rather than by intention. She set the deed box back on the table. James was a good man and I loved him, and when he died something in me went very quiet for a long time. But the quiet was not surrender. I just needed to be still for a while before I knew what I wanted to do next. And you came back, August said. I came back, she said. This is my land. This is my life. No one gets to decide what I do with it except me. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight and thought that she was the most complete person he had ever met. Not without grief or loss, she had those things, and they were real, and she did not pretend otherwise, but complete in the sense of knowing herself, knowing what she wanted, knowing where she stood. He had spent 10 years drifting across the territory telling himself he was looking for opportunity, and he was beginning to understand that what he had actually been looking for was this: a person who knew how to be a place worth coming home to. He said none of this because the timing was complicated and the title hearing was still 2 weeks away, and there was a lot of ground yet to cover. But he thought it. He met Samuel Briggs for the first time in the second week of June, when Briggs rode out to the homestead for a final preparation meeting before the hearing. He was a compact, precise man in his 40s, with rimless spectacles and a very calm manner that suggested he had spent a great deal of time in courtrooms and was not afraid of them. He shook August's hand with a measured assessment in his eyes and then turned his full attention to the case. August laid out what he knew about Holt's practices. The way the company identified properties whose owners had been absent for more than 3 months and filed expedited abandoned property claims before the owners could respond. The way Holt cultivated relationships with certain county-level officials, and specifically the way he had attempted to manufacture a right-of-way claim on the Rhodes property when the first approach had failed. Briggs listened and asked sharp, specific questions, and at the end of it he nodded with the satisfaction of a man adding a useful tool to a well-organized toolbox. Your testimony will be useful, Briggs told August. I want you there, but I want you prepared. Holt will have his own attorney and he will try to undermine your credibility. You left his employ under difficult circumstances. I can speak to why I left, August said. Good, tell the truth plainly and do not speculate about what you cannot verify. Briggs looked at him for a moment. You are doing a decent thing, Mr. Redmond. I am doing a late thing, August said. There is a difference. Briggs acknowledged this with a slight incline of his head, and that was all that needed to be said about it. The day of the title hearing arrived on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of June, and the whole of Caldwell Creek seemed to know about it. The courtroom on the 2nd floor of the county building was full by the time August arrived, which was early enough to get a seat near the front. He saw Maria Garza and her husband Tomas in the 3rd row, and the Hendersons from the north end of the county, and he understood that Ella Rhodes had more people in this community than Gerald Holt had credited. Ella herself arrived with Samuel Briggs and sat at the plaintiff's table with her back straight and her hands quiet in her lap, and August watched her and thought that she was the most composed person in that room by a significant margin. Holt sat at the other table with his attorney, a man named Ferris who was not the judge but was the judge's cousin, which Briggs had already noted in his filings as a matter for the record. The hearing lasted most of the day. Briggs was methodical and thorough. He entered the original deed, the chain of title going back to 1861, the property tax records showing continuous payment under Ella's name for the past 18 months, and a signed affidavit from the county land office confirming that no valid abandonment claim could attach to a property whose titled owner was present and maintaining it. He called Ella to the stand, and she answered every question in the same clear, direct voice she used for everything, without embellishment or drama, and the judge, a weathered woman named Justine Morrow, who had come down from the district court, watched her with an expression that was not warm exactly but was clearly paying attention. August testified in the afternoon. He told the truth plainly, as Briggs had advised. He described the nature of his work for Holt's company, the practices he had observed, and the specific circumstances of the Rhodes demolition order, including Holt's assertion that the property was abandoned when August had in fact found it occupied, maintained, and clearly not abandoned in any legal sense. Holt's attorney cross-examined him with some energy, suggesting that his testimony was motivated by personal interest in the plaintiff, and August said steadily that he had worked for Gerald Holt in good faith and had left that employment when he understood the work to be ethically compromised, and that he was testifying because he believed the truth was relevant and because he had an obligation to provide it. The judge recessed for 40 minutes and then returned. She ruled in Ella's favor on every point. The demolition order was quashed. The abandoned property claim was struck. The title was confirmed as clear and uncontested. She also made several pointed comments about the practice of filing expedited claims against absent property owners, comments that were not legally binding, but were clearly intended for the public record, and for the county officials in the room who maintained relationships with the Caldwell Creek Development Company. Gerald Holt left the courtroom without speaking to anyone. His attorney gathered the papers quickly and followed. August noted that neither of them looked in Ella's direction on the way out. The room filled with noise after the gavel came down, and Ella turned in her chair and looked back at August with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not triumph exactly. It was something quieter than that, something that had waited a long time to arrive and was not in any hurry to make a show of itself. Her eyes were bright. He made his way to her through the people crowding around to offer congratulations, and when he reached her she said very quietly so that only he could hear it, "We won." "You won," he said. "I just told the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is worth more than you know." Outside on the courthouse steps, in the warm afternoon sun of a June day in 1884, Maria Garza was crying happy tears and Tomas Garza was shaking Samuel Briggs's hand, and a man August did not recognize was offering to buy the whole party drinks at the saloon down the street, and Ella was standing slightly apart from all of it, looking out at the dusty main street of Caldwell Creek with an expression of quiet relief. August stood beside her. "What will you do now?" he asked. "With the property, I mean." "Exactly what I have been doing," she said. "I want to run cattle. Not many. This land cannot support a large operation, but enough. And I want to keep the garden. And I want to fix the roof on the east side of the barn, which has been worrying me all winter." "That is a good plan," he said. She looked at him sideways. "What will you do?" It was a more complicated question for him, and they both knew it. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "I am somewhat at loose ends, professionally speaking." "You could do legitimate land work," she said. "Survey work, deed research, helping people establish clear title. There must be others in the county in situations like mine who need someone who knows how this business operates." He had thought about this in a general way. "That would take time to build." "Most worthwhile things do," she said. They were quiet for a moment, with the street sounds of the town moving around them, horses and wagon wheels and voices and the distant hammer of the blacksmith 2 blocks over. "Ella," he said. She turned to look at him fully. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say something for a while now, and I am beginning to think I will keep finding reasons to wait. So I am going to say it now, which is probably the wrong moment, but at least it is a moment." He took a breath. "I think I am in love with you. I have been thinking about it long enough to be sure, and I am not asking you to do anything about it right now, but I wanted you to know it." She was very still. The afternoon sun was in her eyes and she did not look away. "August," she said, "you can tell me it is too soon or too complicated or that I have a lot of ground to make up for showing up on your property with a demolition order," he said. "All of those things are probably true." "They are true," she said, "and you do have ground to make up." But there was something in her voice that was not a refusal, and her eyes were warm in a way that they were not always. "I think you should start by coming to supper on Saturday." He let out a breath. "Saturday. And bringing that apple cake you mentioned once that your mother used to make, if you remember how it goes." He looked at her and the corner of his mouth lifted. "I remember." "Good," she said. And she smiled at him, fully, properly, the way he had been hoping she would smile at him for 2 months, and turned back to where Maria Garza was calling her name. August stood on the courthouse steps for another moment in the June afternoon sun, and thought that he had been looking for a place to put down roots for a very long time, and that the ground, here in this particular county, in this particular circumstance, felt remarkably firm. He made the apple cake from memory on Friday, over a fire in the small room he rented above the feed store, and it did not come out as well as his mother's, but it came out well enough. He rode out to the homestead on Saturday with it wrapped in a cloth in his saddlebag, and Ella met him at the gate, and Buckshot wagged his whole body at the sight of the horse, and the late June light was long and honey-colored across the pasture. Supper was roasted chicken, and potatoes from the garden and bread that she made while he sat at the table and talked to her through the kitchen door, and the apple cake was declared a success, even if the edges were a little too brown. After supper they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out over the West Texas sky, which was enormous and very clear, and the creek sounds came up to them on the evening air, and Ella said, without looking away from the stars, "I am not a simple person to be with, August." "I know that," he said. "I am not going to change what I do or how I do it for anyone. I would not want you to." She turned to look at him. "And this is my land. Whatever else happens, this is my land." "Your land," he agreed. "Always." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark, and then she reached over and put her hand on his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she left it there. And neither of them said anything more for a while, and the stars kept coming out, one by one, in the enormous Texas sky. He kissed her for the first time 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when they had been walking the creek line to look at where the bank had eroded over winter and needed reinforcing. They had stopped at a place where a big old cottonwood had half fallen into the water and made a pool of deep shade, and they were looking at the creek and talking about the bank work. And then they were not talking, and then he had turned to her, and she had looked up at him with those amber eyes that never did anything by accident, and he had kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was the kind of kiss that settled something. When they stepped back from it, she looked at him with a small, private smile that he thought he could probably spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. "You took your time," she said. "I was trying to be careful," he said. "You can be a little less careful," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He laughed, which was a sound that surprised them both slightly with its fullness, and she laughed too, and the creek ran beside them and the cottonwood leaves turned silver in the afternoon breeze, and it was a good moment, one of those moments that you know while it is happening will stay with you. Gerald Holt left Caldwell Creek in late July. The title hearing had apparently been the beginning of the end of his operation in the county, partly because Judge Morrow's comments from the bench had prompted a review of several other Holt acquisitions, and partly because the story of the Rhodes counter-injunction had spread among the homesteading community and made his methods considerably more difficult to pursue. He packed up the office above the general store and headed east, and no one in Caldwell Creek was visibly sorry to see him go. August, who had by that point established a small practice helping families research their land titles and file proper deed documentation, was not sorry either. He had 2 regular clients by August, 4 by September, and a letter of recommendation from Samuel Briggs, who referred him work from other parts of the district. It was not a large income, but it was growing, and it was honest, which mattered to him more than he had once thought to admit. He and Ella fell into a rhythm that was particular to them and to the land they were on. He spent most days at his work in town or in the field, and evenings and weekends at the homestead more often than not, helping with the heavier property work and learning, gradually, the rhythms of a working small ranch in the way that a man learns things he intends to make permanent. He learned which of the cattle were Ella's best breeders and which she was planning to sell. He learned the way the land changed in summer and how the creek behaved after a hard rain. He learned the sounds of the homestead at night, the way the boards settled and the dogs shifted, and the wind moved differently through the cottonwoods than through the short pasture grass. He also learned Ella more fully, in the way that takes time and dailiness and the willingness to pay attention. He learned that she was not a morning person for the first half hour, and that coffee was a non-negotiable element of that transition. He learned that she had a deep and unpredictable delight in thunderstorms, which she watched from the porch with the kind of absorbed pleasure most people reserve for fine entertainment. He learned that she read seriously. She had a small but carefully chosen collection of books, and she read them slowly and thought about them, and she liked it when he read something and they could talk about it. He learned that she cried rarely, but when she did it was usually for someone else's trouble, not her own, and that she was much better at receiving care than she thought she was, and that she was the most genuinely good-hearted person he had ever known in a way that was not soft but was steady and real. She learned him too. He could tell by the way she anticipated his moods and the way she knew when to talk and when to let things be quiet. She asked him once, in a careful way, about what he thought of himself, not as a question about his character in the abstract, but specifically about the time he had spent working for Holt. She wanted to know whether he had made peace with it. He told her the truth. He had not done the worst of what Holt had done, but he had known something was wrong for longer than he had acted on it, and that was something he carried. He had tried to make it right as fully as he could, and he would keep trying, but he did not think carrying it was a bad thing. It reminded him to pay attention. She had nodded and looked at him steadily and then said, "That is a very grown-up answer." "I am 28, he said. "I know," she said. "Most 28-year-olds I have met have not gotten there yet." In the fall, when the harvest was in and the cattle had been sorted for the season and the first true cold had come down from the north, August asked Ella to marry him. He did not make a dramatic production of it. It was an evening in October, with the windows of the farmhouse warm against the dark, and they had eaten supper, and he had helped clear the table and they were standing in the kitchen. And he simply turned to her and said that he loved her and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life on this land with her, and that he was asking her to marry him. She looked at him for a long time. He waited. He had learned to wait with her because she thought carefully about things that mattered, and rushing her led nowhere useful. "This is my land," she said. "That does not change." "It is your land," he said. "That does not change. And I make my own decisions about this property." "You do. I would be here as your partner, not your manager." Another long look. Something in her face was very still and very intent, the way she looked when she was certain of something she wanted to be sure about before she said it. "Yes," she said. "August, yes." He put his arms around her, and she came against him with that characteristic quality of hers, deliberate, full, unhurried, and outside the window, the autumn stars were extraordinary. They were married in December of 1884, in the small Methodist church in Caldwell Creek, by a minister named Peters who had been in the county since before either of them were born. Ella wore a dress of deep green wool that her mother had sent from Tennessee when Ella wrote with the news, and August wore his best coat, which he had pressed for the occasion, and Samuel Briggs was there as a witness, and Maria and Tomas Garza were there, and the Henderson family, and half a dozen other homesteading families who had come to know Ella over the course of her months back on the property. The service was simple, and the reception was in the church hall with cider and cake, and a fiddle player named Duncan who was 80 years old and still played with extraordinary feeling. August danced with his wife for the first time to a slow air that Duncan played without being asked, as if he had known exactly what the occasion required. She was not a natural dancer, she admitted in his ear mid-song. "Neither am I," he said. "We will muddle through together." She laughed, and that warm, full laugh was the sound of the beginning of their life together. They spent the winter on the homestead, the two of them in Buckshot, through the long cold months when the wind came in hard from the north, and the creek went low and clear under its skin of ice. It was a good winter, the best August had had in memory. They read together in the evenings, taking turns reading aloud by the lamp, a habit they had begun in the fall, and that had settled into a regular pleasure. They talked about the coming year's plan for the ranch, a small expansion of the cattle herd, a chicken coop, repairs to the barn roof that had been concerning Ella since before August arrived in her life. They talked about the land and the community and the future, and the conversations were always interesting because she was always interesting, and because thinking through things with her made his own thinking clearer. There were harder things, too, in those winter months. He sent a letter to his father, whom he had not spoken to in 2 years, and told him he had married and was settled in Comanche County, and got back a brief, stiff reply that was not warm but was an answer, and he thought that was probably as much as was possible and tried to be content with it. Ella wrote to her mother in Tennessee and got back a long, affectionate letter full of her mother's relief and happiness that Ella was not alone, and questions about the property and the town in August, which Ella answered thoroughly. In the spring of 1885, when the land was greening up again and the air smelled of new growth, Ella told him she was expecting a child. He stood very still for a moment when she told him, in the kitchen after breakfast, with the spring morning coming through the window and Buckshot asleep in his usual spot by the door. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her hands in both of his and looked at her face, which was watchful and a little uncertain in the way she looked when she was not sure how something would land. "Ella," he said, "that is the best news I have ever heard in my life." The uncertainty resolved into something bright and real in her eyes. "I thought you would think so," she said, "but I wanted to be sure." The pregnancy was not easy in the early months. Ella was sick with it in the mornings in a way that frustrated her practical nature, because there was always work to do, and a body that would not cooperate was an inconvenience she had not planned for. August took over the heavier chores without being asked and was careful not to make a fuss about it, which was exactly the right approach, and Maria Garza came 3 times a week through the worst of it and was a steady, gentle presence that Ella accepted with real gratitude. By summer she was better, and by midsummer she was genuinely well, and the baby's arrival was expected in November. In the meantime, August's land practice continued to grow. He had 7 regular clients by midsummer and had helped 2 families in the county resist improper land claims of a different kind than Holt's, and he had developed a working relationship with a surveyor named Cal Morris who was honest and competent. And together, they had begun providing a service that filled a genuine need in the region. He was building something real, and it was connected to this land and this community. And that sense of connection was something he had not understood before as being something he needed. One afternoon in August, a young man rode up to the homestead and said he was looking for the land agent who had helped the Kowalski family establish their title claim. This turned out to be August, and the young man's family was a homesteading family 20 miles to the east who was facing a situation not unlike what Ella had faced with Holt, except that the pressure was coming from a different direction. A cattle baron named Graves who had been acquiring land in that part of the county through aggressive and not always ethical means. August took the case and began research the next week. He brought Samuel Briggs in, and the situation resolved itself over the course of 2 months without needing to go to a hearing, because the family's title was clean, and the paperwork filing on Graves's claim had an error that Briggs caught, and that unraveled the whole approach. It was exactly the kind of work August had come to understand he was good at, and which he did well precisely because he knew how the other side operated. He told Ella about it that evening, and she listened with that focused, complete attention she gave to things, and at the end she said, "You are very good at this." "I am getting there," he said. "No," she said, "you are there. What you do matters to people who are in very frightening situations, and you do it honestly and well. Give yourself the credit." He was quiet for a moment. "You are very good at that," he said. "At what?" "At saying things that are true that I need to hear." She looked at him with that slight smile. "I know," she said. "It is part of the partnership." Their son was born in November of 1885 during a cold rain that beat against the windows of the farmhouse in steady, rhythmic waves. Ella labored for 12 hours with a midwife named Mrs. Alcott, who was brisk and competent and entirely unimpressed by the difficulty of the situation, which was exactly the kind of help Ella needed. August waited in the kitchen and found that the waiting was significantly harder than anything he had ever done on horseback, and at some point in the early morning hours, Maria Garza, who had come as soon as she heard, simply sat across the table from him and did not talk, which was the best possible thing she could have done. The baby arrived just before dawn, and Mrs. Alcott brought him out to August with the slightly formal pride of someone presenting an excellent piece of work, and said, "A fine, healthy boy, Mr. Redmond, and your wife as well." August held his son for the first time in the kitchen doorway while the rain was letting up outside, and the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east. The baby was very small and very particular. A real face already, not just a squashed approximation of one, and he gripped August's finger with a ferocity that seemed entirely disproportionate to his size. He took his son in to Ella, who was exhausted in the full, honest way of someone who has done a very hard thing successfully, and she held the baby and looked at him with an expression that August thought was probably one of the most purely real things he had ever seen on any human face. "Thomas," Ella said. She had decided on the name after her grandfather. "Thomas." August sat beside her on the edge of the bed and put his arm around her, carefully, and she leaned into him, and Thomas Rhodes Redmond, 7 pounds and determined, slept. The years that followed were the fabric of a life well and specifically lived. Thomas grew into a boy who had his mother's amber eyes and his father's dark hair, and a personality that was apparently his own invention, headstrong and funny and deeply curious. The kind of child who needed to know exactly how everything worked and was willing to take things apart to find out. He followed Buckshot everywhere from the time he could walk, and Buckshot, who was getting old by then, bore this with an elderly patience that August found extremely moving. When Thomas was 3, Ella told August that a second child was coming, and this time he was not still. He picked her up, carefully but definitely, and she laughed and told him to put her down, and he did, but he was smiling for the rest of the day. The second child was a girl, born in the early spring, and they named her Clara after Ella's mother. Clara was quieter than Thomas, but not by much, and she had from her earliest months a quality of deliberate attention that made Ella say, more than once, that she recognized it. She was the kind of child who watched everything carefully before she moved, and then moved with great conviction. With 2 children and a growing practice and the ranch work, the homestead in those years was a lively and sometimes chaotic place, and August loved every part of it. He loved the mornings when he was up before the children, and the light was coming in thin and gold through the east window, and the coffee was hot and Ella was still asleep, and the whole day was ahead. He loved the evenings when both children were on the porch, and Thomas was asking approximately 47 questions, and Ella was answering the interesting ones and redirecting the ones that led nowhere useful. He loved the particular quality of Sunday afternoons when the work was done, and there was time to simply be in the place and with the people. He and Ella continued to talk about everything, which was one of the things he thought he loved most about their marriage. They did not agree about everything. She was more cautious than him in financial decisions, and he was more willing to take calculated risks, and they were both stubborn in different registers. But they argued honestly and listened to each other and generally arrived at conclusions that were better than either had started with. One evening in the summer when Thomas was 5 and Clara was 2, they were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become the fixed ritual of their evenings, and August said, "Do you remember the first time I sat on this porch?" Ella looked at him with a glint of amusement. "You had a demolition order in your coat pocket," she said. "And you looked like a man who knew he was in the wrong place and was trying to decide what to do about it." "I did know," he said, "from about the moment I pulled up and saw the whitewash in the garden and you coming around the side of the house looking like you had already handled whatever I was about to say." "I had," she said. "Mr. Briggs had done excellent work." "He had," August agreed, "though I thought at the time that you looked like you would have handled it even without the lawyer." She considered this with the slight tilt of her head that meant she was being honest with herself. "I think I would have," she said, "but having Mr. Briggs's papers was much more satisfying." There is something very gratifying about watching a man fold up a demolition order and put it away. "I imagine," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Ella, I am glad I came that morning. I know that sounds strange given that I came with papers that were trying to take your land." "It is not strange," she said. "I am glad too, though I would have preferred a different introduction." "What would you have preferred?" She thought about it. "You could have come as a stranger who needed help with directions," she said. "I could have given them to you. You could have ridden off and come back the next day with some better excuse." He laughed. "I would have come back with fence staples and the pretense of asking about the eastern boundary." "That would have been transparent," she said. "Thoroughly," he agreed. She reached across and took his hand, the way she had that first night on the porch, and held it, and they sat looking out at the land that was hers and theirs, the pasture going blue-green in the evening light, the cottonwoods dark along the creek, the first stars appearing in the wide sky above. "August," she said. "Yes, I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone assembling the right words for something important. "When I came back to this land, I was not entirely sure I had made the right decision. I knew I wanted the land. I was certain of that. But I did not know if I was strong enough on my own to hold it and build something real on it. And then Gerald Holt sent you with that order, which was an extremely poor strategic decision on his part because you were the worst possible person he could have sent." "Because I put the order away," August said. "Because you put it away," she said. "And sat on my porch and drank my coffee and mended my fence and told me the truth about things and kept coming back. And somewhere in there I stopped being uncertain, not just about the land but about everything." She squeezed his hand. "You did not make me strong. I was already strong. But you made me remember that I did not have to be strong alone, which is a different thing and one I needed to learn." He thought about this for a moment, about the full weight of what she had said and what it cost her, who was careful with the things she said, to say it. He turned his hand in hers so that their fingers were linked. "I was not strong enough to do the right thing until you showed me what it looked like," he said. "So I think we are even." She looked at him with those amber eyes, warm and direct and entirely steady. "We are even," she said, "and better than either of us was before." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, and she leaned against his shoulder, and Thomas, who had been supposed to be in bed for the past 20 minutes, appeared in the doorway with an elaborate and unconvincing expression of innocence. Clara was apparently fast asleep, as she generally was at this hour, being sensible. "Thomas," Ella said without looking up, "go back to bed." "I was just getting water," Thomas said. "You got your water. Go to bed." "But the frogs will be there tomorrow," August said. "They have made a commitment to this property." Thomas considered this and apparently found it satisfactory because he disappeared back inside with minimal additional negotiation. They heard his small feet cross the floorboards, and then the creak of the bed, and then silence. Ella's shoulders moved in a quiet laugh. "He is exactly like you," she said. He is exactly like you, August said. The frogs are a legitimate topic of inquiry. Tomorrow, she said firmly. The frogs will be there tomorrow. Buckshot, who had been asleep by the door through all of this, sighed enormously and resettled himself. He was 11 years old and had grown gray around his muzzle, and he slept more than he once had. But he was still present and still attentive, and still regarded the horizon with the same intelligent suspicion he always had. August thought, sitting there with his wife leaning against him, and the land spread out before them in the summer dark, that this was the thing he had not known how to want when he was younger, not a dramatic or eventful happiness, but a specific and daily one. A full house and a working piece of land, and a person who knew him and told him the truth. He had ridden across a good portion of the Texas territory looking for something, and it had turned out to be right here, in a place he had initially arrived at for entirely the wrong reasons. He was grateful for the wrong reasons. They had brought him to the right ones. Samuel Briggs retired from practice 3 years later and wrote a letter that arrived on a Thursday morning, and which Ella read at the breakfast table with an expression that August recognized as the combination of fondness and sadness that accompanied the news of something deserved. He says he is going to San Antonio, she said. His daughter is there. He was a good lawyer, August said. He was an excellent lawyer, Ella said, and a decent man. She set the letter down. He says he is glad he could help and that he has watched our situation with a good deal of pleasure over the years and that the county is better for having people in it who are willing to stand on the right side of the law even when it is inconvenient. High praise from Briggs, August said. Very, she agreed. She picked up her coffee. We should write to him in San Antonio. We should, he said. I will write this week. Thomas, who was 7 by this point and had the reading ability of a 10-year-old and the opinion distribution of someone considerably older, looked up from his breakfast. Who is Mr. Briggs? He is the lawyer who helped us keep this land, Ella said. Thomas turned this over. He had heard the story in pieces over the years, the manner in which his mother had fought for the homestead, the demolition order, the counter-injunction, the title hearing. He had not been alive for any of it, but he had absorbed it in the way children absorb the foundational stories of their families, as something real and important and defining. Will you write him a letter saying the land is still here? He asked. Ella looked at August, and August looked at Ella, and the look between them was the kind that happens between people who have been building something together for years and know its full weight. Yes, Ella said to her son. That is exactly what we will tell him, that the land is still here. The years kept moving, the way they do, and the land held. The cattle herd grew to a comfortable size, and Ella managed it with the same deliberate competence she brought to everything. August's practice expanded, and eventually he was working across 4 counties, helping families establish clear title and resist improper claims, and the work was known as trustworthy, which in West Texas was a specific kind of currency. A young man from the Territorial Land Office came out to interview him once for a piece in the county record and asked how he had gotten into the field, and August said he had started out on the other side of the question and had been fortunate enough to have someone show him the difference. The young man asked who that had been, and August said his wife. Ella, who was in the kitchen and could hear the conversation through the open door, said nothing, but he was fairly certain he heard the sound of a quiet, satisfied smile. Clara grew into a girl who was methodical and persistent, and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and her own particular quality of concentration. She decided at age 8 that she was going to learn to read land surveys, and she did, working through the materials in August's office with a seriousness that he found both moving and entirely predictable. She was going to be remarkable at something, he thought. He was not yet sure what. Thomas, at 10, was already the kind of boy who would stop to help someone fix a wheel on the road without being asked, and who remembered the names of everyone he met and asked after their families when he saw them again. He had the quality, as the children of genuinely happy people sometimes do, of assuming that the world was fundamentally hospitable, and of generally being proven right. There was an evening in the late fall of 1892, when August was 36 and Ella was 33 and Thomas was 7 and Clara was 4, that August thought about a great deal afterward. They had all been out in the pasture at sunset, the 4 of them and Buckshot's successor, a young cattle dog named Scout who was all enthusiasm and very little judgment, and the light was doing the thing it did in West Texas in November, turning everything amber and vast and lit from within, and the land stretched out around them without any visible boundary, just grass and sky and the distant dark line of the creek trees. Ella had picked up Clara, who was tired, and Clara had put her cheek against her mother's shoulder and was watching the sky with those deliberate eyes. Thomas was running for the sheer pleasure of it, and Scout was running with him, and the 2 of them kept looking back at August and Ella as if to confirm that the adults were seeing how excellent this was. August stood beside Ella and watched his children and the land and the light, and the feeling that came over him was one he did not have a word for, not happiness exactly, though it was that, but something larger. The sense of standing in a place that was specifically yours, that had been arrived at specifically, through specific choices, and that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Ella looked at him. She always knew when he was having a moment he could not quite articulate. "Good," she said. "Yes," he said. "Very," she nodded, looking back at the children and the land and the light. "So am I," she said. "Very." Scout came bounding back and knocked into August's legs with the joyful mindlessness of a young dog, and Thomas came after him apologizing and laughing, and Clara lifted her head from Ella's shoulder to observe this development with scientific interest, and the evening moved toward dark in the way that good evenings do, unhurrying. Later, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat at the kitchen table together, which was where they did some of their best talking, with the lamp between them and the last of the November wind at the windows. They talked about the following year's plans, about a section of the east fence that needed replacing, about a family 2 counties over that August was helping with a title dispute. They talked about a letter from Ella's mother, who was well but elderly now and thinking about coming west for a visit in the spring, which would be the first time she had seen the homestead. They talked about Thomas's reading and Clara's interest in land surveys, and whether Scout was ever going to learn not to knock into people. And then there was a comfortable silence, the kind that sits well between people who have nothing to prove to each other, and Ella said, "Do you remember what you said on the courthouse steps, when you told me how you felt? I said I was in love with you and that I was not asking you to do anything about it immediately," he said, "and that I was aware you could tell me it was too complicated. And I told you to come to supper," she said. "You told me to bring apple cake," he said. "Which you did," she said, with slightly overdone edges. "I was nervous," he said. She smiled. "I know, it was endearing." She looked at him steadily. "It was the right thing, August, everything that came after. It was exactly right." He reached across the table and took her hand. "It was exactly right," he agreed. They went to bed with the November wind outside and the lamp turned down, and the house full of sleeping children, and the particular piece of a night in a place that is yours and has been defended and kept and built into something real. August lay in the dark and listened to Ella's breathing even out into sleep, and to the wind, and to the sounds the old farmhouse made as it settled, and he thought about the morning he had ridden up that road with a demolition order in his coat pocket and a speech prepared, and about the woman who had come around the side of the house with her basket of eggs and her counter-order and her lawyer's sealed injunction, and her amber eyes that told him, before a word was spoken between them, that this was not going to go the way Gerald Holt had planned. He was glad. He was profoundly, specifically, enduringly glad. The land was still here. The house was still here. The deed was still in the box with the brass latch under the floorboard. The name on it was Rhodes, and the name beside it was Redmond, and the 2 of them had made something on this land that was bigger and more lasting than a demolition order or a land company or a desperate man's bad strategy. He fell asleep with his hand resting on the quilt beside Ella's shoulder, and outside the window the West Texas sky was enormous and bright with stars. The same stars it had always been, indifferent to borders and orders and claims, shining on a piece of ground that had been held and kept and loved, and would be still. When spring came the following year, Ella's mother arrived from Tennessee on the eastbound train, which now reached Caldwell Creek, and stepped down onto the platform with a traveling bag and an expression of alert curiosity that made August understand immediately where Ella had come by that quality. Her name was Helen, and she was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had the straight back of someone who had refused to let time have everything its own way. She stood on the porch of the farmhouse in the April morning and looked out at the land with an expression that was hard to read, and then she said, "Your grandfather would have been very pleased." Ella stood beside her. "I know," she said. Thomas showed his grandmother the property with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that this was important, pointing out the cattle and the garden, and the repaired barn roof and the eastern fence and Scout, who was now a year old and fully grown and had, it should be noted, mostly learned not to knock into people. Clara walked beside them holding her grandmother's hand, and explaining the land survey methodology with 4-year-old precision that made Helen look at August over Clara's head, with an expression of astonished amusement. Helen stayed for 3 weeks, and she helped with the garden and told Ella things about her father that Ella had not heard before, and she sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the long light move across the land, and on her last day she told August privately that she was glad he was who he was. He was not sure exactly what she meant, but he thought he understood. "I am glad too," he said. She left on the Tuesday morning train, and Ella stood on the platform and watched the train go with dry eyes and an expression that was not sad but was full, the way she looked when something had been exactly what it needed to be. August stood beside her. "She loved it," he said. "Did," Ella said. "She finally understands why I came back." "Did she not before?" Ella considered. "She understood that I needed to. She did not quite understand that I needed to because it was right, not just because I was stubborn." "She understands now," he said. Ella nodded. Then she turned from the platform and looked at him, and the April light was in her hair and on her face, and she looked exactly like herself, which was the best thing she ever looked like. "Take me home," she said. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked down the main street of Caldwell Creek toward where Copper's successor, a steady gray mare named Sage, and the small wagon were waiting. The town had changed over the years. There was a proper schoolhouse now, and a small medical office, and the general store had expanded, and 2 new families had settled on homesteads north of the creek. The development company was gone, and its methods with it, and the land of Comanche County was in the hands of people who lived on it and worked it and knew its particular character. It was a good town, getting better. August had had something to do with that in his way, and so had Ella, and so had Samuel Briggs from his office in Abilene, and now his retirement in San Antonio. These things add up over time, the honest work of people trying to do right by each other and the land, and the results are not always visible in the immediate moment, but they accumulate. The way creek water accumulates behind a good dam, steady and real and building towards something. They drove home through the spring morning, with Thomas sitting in the back of the wagon asking questions about the train engine's mechanism, and Clara asleep against his side, with the boneless confidence of a child who has never had cause to doubt that someone will make sure she does not fall, and Scout running alongside the wagon with his nose in every smell the roadside offered. The homestead came into view ahead of them, the whitewashed farmhouse with its new porch boards, the kitchen garden coming up in its careful rows along the south wall, the barn with its repaired roof, the pasture running green in the April rain, the cottonwoods dark along the creek, and the sky above everything enormous and blue and fully present in the way of West Texas sky, which does not hedge its commitments. Ella was quiet beside him on the wagon seat, and then she said, "3 generations of my family held this land." "Yes," August said. "For now," she said. She meant their children. He thought about that. About the deed in the box with the brass latch and all the names on it and the ones that would be added. About the long chain of held ground and defended title and the choice, made over and over by different people in different circumstances, to stay and fight and keep. "For now," he agreed. She leaned against his shoulder for a moment, the way she had been doing for years on the porch in the evenings, easy and settled and without any ceremony. He turned the wagon through the gate and up the familiar lane toward the house, and the children stirred in the back, and Scout was already at the door barking his announcement of their return to an empty house that would now not be empty, and the spring morning was everything it was supposed to be. He brought the wagon to a stop and helped Ella down, and she stood in the yard and looked at her land, all of it, the whole reach of it from the creek to the south fence to the far eastern pasture, the way she had looked at it on the morning he first rode up that road, with that same quality of clear and specific recognition. This is mine. This is real. This is here. Then she looked at him with those amber eyes, warm and steady and entirely certain of what they were seeing. "Well, August Redmond," she said, "are you glad you stayed?" He thought of the demolition order, folded in his coat pocket on a spring morning 8 years ago. He thought of the counter-injunction in her hand, and the lawyer's seal, and the look on her face that had told him something he had not yet understood but was already beginning to learn. He thought of fence mending, and apple cake, and a courthouse step in June, and a kitchen table, and a November evening, and a baby in the early morning light, and a daughter explaining land surveys, and a son who stopped to help people on the road. He thought of every morning since that first one, and the particular dailiness of a life built on honest ground with someone you were still learning and still glad to know. "Yes," he said, "I am extremely glad I stayed." She smiled at him, that full, private, real smile that he had been trying to deserve for 8 years, and intended to spend the rest of his life continuing to deserve, and turned toward the house, calling for Thomas to bring in the bags and for Clara not to let Scout into the kitchen before he had wiped his paws. August stood for another moment in the yard, in the April morning, on the land that was hers and theirs, and he thought that this was the best thing he had ever done, and that he had barely known he was doing it until it was already the truest thing about him. Then he went inside into the warm and particular life of it, and the door closed behind him, and the land lay quiet in the spring sun, held and keeping, exactly as it had always been and would be still.